Hi everyone, my name is Hui Wen.
I'm Go.
And today we are doing a short video about argumentation in debate. And this video is part of the Hart House Debating Club's outreach initiative, where we will be posting videos about the different elements of debate. So a general structure of how this video will go is that first I'll give a quick intro as to what the role of argumentation is in debate, and then Goat will talk about the structure of an argument, and then we'll apply that to a real life context with a specific motion, just as an example. So as an intro, argumentation is really the thought process that you use to prove a point and incorporates a lot of critical thinking and reasoning skills. What an argument is not is simply stating that you favor one position, stringing together reasonable sounding statements without really explaining why they're reasonable, or stating truisms without including anything that's really challengeable. So for example, we should save the environment. Sure, but why should we save the environment, right? So an assertion is that type of statement where you would say something without proof. And an argument is different from that in that it always contains ample analysis to prove why an idea is reasonably likely to be true. So to recap, what argumentation is one, using evidence to support your thought process, two, distinguishing between the pros and cons of the different positions on an issue, and then lastly, three, weighing the pros and cons to come to a conclusion to support your argument.
Okay, so I'm going to offer you a structure of argumentation. You don't have to use this exactly. The most important thing to know is that argumentation is a very personal thing, and it's going to depend on what your skills are, what you prefer, what feels most comfortable to you. But that being said, the 7 components that we have to an argument here are compiled from a variety of Hart House debaters to sort of make sense of the things you should be looking out for, at least. So the first element of an argument should always exist, and that is the point title. You want to be able to summarize your argument in 1 or 2 sentences, because that's what the judge is going to remember about your case. So if you can briefly state it, then it'll be effective. If we use an example, for example, like the motion about creating a universal basic income, your argument title might be, you should have a universal basic income because it allows for more upward social mobility. And most of the time you want to think about what the argument achieves as the title of the argument itself. And then moving on to the second part, the context. This is going to depend on the debate. If you have a round about a particular political issue, it might be useful to give some background here or a historical context. This might not be necessary in all motions, but it does help to have. The third component is a very popular buzzword in debating. It's called the mechanisms. Essentially, it's a fancy term for how the motion creates the impacts or the outcomes that you describe. So it's what links these two things. So the motion and the end results. The mechanism is really the thing in the middle. And essentially what it proves is why your arguments are true. And the key here is making sure to connect the motion to your impacts as a result of the specific mechanisms you outline. Hui Wen is going to give you an example of this to help you afterwards. The fourth component to an argument, which you can move around in the order, by the way, is the example. You should always aim to have at least one example per argument to really illustrate to the judge what you're talking about. The fifth is the impact. This is the bread and butter of debating. This is essentially the takeaway that the judge is going to remember from your arguments. And essentially you want to relate it to how the argument affects people personally. So the point about universal basic income creating more upward social mobility is going to have pretty clear impacts. For instance, you being able to move out of poverty, or you having more job security, and so on. But you really want to make these clear, concise, and emphasized. But notably, you can't have good impacts unless you had clear mechanisms to explain why they were true. That's really, really important, and we'll get back to that in a second. The sixth thing is the link to the motion. Not always necessary, but good to have. You really want to explain why. The motion creates the impacts that you desire, and more specifically than that, your particular side of the motion achieves those impacts. And it's really important to just connect it to the specific context of the motion. The more specific you get with your links to the wording of the motion, probably the better. And then finally, another very popular buzzword in debating, the comparative. This will apply to an extent in first speeches, more so in second speeches, but here what you want to establish is not only why your arguments are true and important, which is what you achieved with your mechanisms and impacts respectively, you want to explain why your arguments are more important than the other sides of the debate. Because remember, this is a competition. So some weighing mechanisms that we use to compare arguments are, number one, why your arguments are more likely to happen than the other sides. This is probably the most important one because judges are unlikely to believe your arguments if you didn't prove them to be likely in the first place. The second part is magnitude, another fancy word for how big your impact is. Does it affect a lot of people? Does it affect a particular group very significantly? To that end, the magnitude of the impact is also pretty important. And the third one, which I think doesn't apply to every round, is the time frame of the argument. Whether it happens in the short term or the long term, and which is more important. Which in a sense also relies on the previous two comparison mechanisms, but nonetheless can be important in a debate, for instance, about like climate change, right? Where you might have really important long-term consequences that you want to weigh out for the judge. So that's the structure. Use it as you wish. You can move certain parts around depending on what's more useful to you, but these are just things that you should look out for when building your arguments. And now we're going to test those with Hui Wen.
Yes, so the fun motion that we have to apply all these theoretical points is this House would implement a universal basic income. So let's pretend that we're on opening government and that we've modeled this in Canada and we've done all that work, and now we just have to state our first argument. So my first point would be, in stating that UBI would allow those living in precarious economic conditions to become self-sufficient. The context I would provide for this argument is that we are living at a time of rising automation, which threatens the job of those who are most vulnerable, who are working in cheaper paid conditions, and thus it would worsen those folks' job insecurity. And now the average worker has no social safety net to fall back on when bad things happen to them, which means that one unfortunate event or one bad health bill will result in them falling to debt, which can compound very quickly. And the mechanism in which UBI would solve this would be that UBI prevents the worst of precarity from occurring by offering essentially a guaranteed social safety net for people to rely on. So by having a guaranteed income, people are able to pay for their essentials between periods of economic instability and invest in things such as education, health, or housing in order to increase their own capacity. And an example of this is someone out of a job, they might still need to pay rent in that period where they're trying to find a new job. And instead of falling back on their rent payments or taking out more debt in order to pay for that rent, if they had a basic income, they could use that basic income to pay that rent, and they wouldn't have debt once they find a new job, and they wouldn't have the pressure of trying to find other ways to make that up. So you can see how that frees up a lot of people's mindsets to be able to actually contribute to society. And the impact of this, which is basically just what I mentioned, right? People are less likely to fall into precarity, and this enables them to contribute to society without being indebted. And a comparative would be to traditional social security, which really takes away the agency of individuals to choose for themselves what the best way to spend money is, right? Because it's very contingent on you applying to employment insurance and then healthcare and then so on and so forth. So whereas UBI, everybody can get it. Everybody is able to use it in the best and most productive way for them, and it's kind of a simple solution in that case without requiring a lot of bureaucracy. So that's kind of how I would apply all the argumentation frameworks that Go outlined to a real motion. I would highly encourage that you guys use this motion and then come up with your own ways of filling the argumentation structure, ways of making it more specific or more unique, and think about more points in which you can use to practice. But that is all. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.